Hello everyone and welcome to IPT 520 this week. We're going to be talking about distance education, which, as I'm sure you probably already know, is an extremely important topic for our field. In fact, it's pretty much an essential thing to understand and to know how to do, because so much of education is moving to at least having some online components, and they're looking to instructional designers as the people who understand how to make this happen effectively. So it's really critical that you understand not only how to develop things online, but that you also understand learning theory and good instructional design practice, and what kinds of instructional design practices can make online learning more effective. Because those are the questions that a lot of people have as they're thinking about distance education, is how we can make it as effective as we possibly can. And something that I'm pretty confident that you will be asked about when you go on the job market for almost every kind of job out there. It was definitely something I was asked about when I was on the job market as a professor. They asked me if I understood how to teach and design online experiences. So an important topic. I wish we could spend more time on this than we can. We're going to be spending just 1 week. There's obviously a lot more that we could do with this. You'll see aspects of distance education showing up in many of the other units that we talk about. And so you'll see flavors of it in everything that we do. This is 1 week to just dedicate ourselves to it specifically. And if you find this interesting, Charles Graham teaches a 692R class every other year. That is, they're working in the process of changing that to having a different course number, so the course number might change. But it's on research of distance learning environments. And then, of course, Peter Rich teaches in his 560 and 760 development classes skills for developing online and mobile kinds of experiences. So I would look to those kinds of classes as ways of getting more expertise on distance education if this is something you feel like you need to learn more about. So first, let's start out just by talking about what is distance learning. And of course, as you can imagine, there's lots of varying opinions about this, different ways to define it. I like this definition. It comes from Michael Moore, who is someone that really is worth knowing and someone that, has had a fair bit to say about distance learning. He's the editor of the Handbook of Distance Education. He is also the editor of the American Journal of Distance Education and the author of Transactional Distance Theory and Interaction Theory. And that's been something that's pretty well received, of course. So he said, with Kersley, all planned learning that normally occurs in a different place from the teaching, requiring special techniques of course design and instruction, communication through various technologies, and special organizational and administrative arrangements. The reason I like this definition is not only does it just say that distance learning is learning that happens apart from teaching, which is maybe one simplistic way to define it, but he says that distance learning requires special techniques for design and instruction, special kinds of organizational communication patterns, and special technologies. And I think that is accurate. We can't just take what we do face-to-face and do it online. We need to think about how we can do online differently because it is a different kind of instruction. So it's growing quite rapidly, as you can imagine, and these statistics are also they're a couple years old, so it's of course accelerated much since I had first put these statistics together. But as of a couple years ago, we were getting over 100 dissertations a year on the topic of distance learning. 1 in 6 higher education students have an online class, and that's growing quite substantially. That's 3.5 million college students and 1 million online K-12 enrollments, and that's an area that really is growing substantially. You probably have noticed here in Utah the push to offer online education at an accelerated level for all the students here in Utah. It's something like the first year you have to offer at least 2 online classes that they could take instead of face-to-face classes, and then it's going to be 4 classes the next year, 6 classes the next year, 8, and so on until there's going to be quite a few options for students to take either face-to-face or online. And we know because of some of the convenience factors of online learning that many students will take that option and will be doing online education because then they can go work and do internships and do things like that. Consequently, we need to prepare our teachers. I work with K-12 teachers and they're not ready for this, and as I teach them in IPT 286 and other settings, I try to explain to them that they need to become familiar with how to teach effectively online, because I can almost guarantee that they will do so. If they're going to be hanging around for at least 10 years in their careers, they're probably going to have the chance to teach online. 95% of colleges and universities using some form of e-learning system, and this is continuing to grow rapidly, of course. You know, and also some of you are familiar with Clayton Christensen, who talked about disruptive innovations and things that kind of disrupt our normal way of life and that are really innovative. And he's talked about that concept in terms of education with online learning. And he predicts that in about 5 years, I think is what he said. So in the next few years, we're just going to have... Okay, sorry about that. I had to pause to go make sure I knew my information correctly. That's one nice thing about delivering a presentation via videos. You can pause it to go double check your information. So I just looked it up. What Clayton Christensen and Michael Horn and some of his colleagues have predicted is that by the year 2014, 50% of all university students will be taking at least some online classes. So that 1 in 6 number that you see there should improve up to 50% just within the next couple years. And they also estimate that this will result in a savings of about, well, once students are taking all of their classes online, that online learning itself can present a savings of about 40% for each student, so the student and the system. So some interesting numbers there about why it's growing and how it's going to continue to grow. So as online learning continues to grow, it's fun to look back and know a little bit about the history of online learning, and probably many of you are familiar with this, but if you're not, it's good to be aware of where we've come from so that we can kind of understand where we are. This comes from a blog post that I posted once, and I've always wanted to turn this into a paper, and I've never gotten around to it. And in fact, if any of you are interested, I'd love to sit down and actually have a reason to get back to this and maybe work on putting this together and submitting it somewhere. But I think you can look at online learning in terms of some periods that we've had. And these are just my ideas, and these are open for debate. And so in fact, one of the questions I have for you that I would like you to respond to is whether you feel like these are the correct periods, or maybe if they should be adjusted in any way based on your understanding and the experiences you've had. So period 1 would be text. Distance learning began before the current model of being internet-based, with the correspondence models where you would send a packet in the mail with a textbook, the student would complete it, send the assignments back by mail, and that was all text-based, but according to Moore's definition of being just separated from the teacher and then requiring some special communication patterns, that was distance learning. So that was the original kind of form of distance learning. And we then progressed to doing computer-based kinds of instruction, where you could do the same kind of thing but do it with a CD-ROM, but you were still the amount of communication interaction between students and teachers was very limited. It was mostly just the student interacting with the material on a computer-based program. In fact, you'll see as we go through these periods that one of the trends is an increase in interaction. So period 3 would be distance transmission, where the internet started to transmit these materials instead of computer-based software. This period 4 would be when we started to add more interaction, and a term came out that you should know about called CSCL, which is Computer Supported Collaborative Learning. And these folks are very connected to the learning science people. In fact, the Learning Science Conference is held every 2 years, and on the off year, everyone goes to the CSCL conference. So it's pretty much the same group of people. And so CSCL is how the learning science people talk about interaction. And it's different from maybe some of the ways other people talk about interaction in online learning. But it emphasized creating interactive spaces where people could interact online around the content and talk to each other, not just complete assignments and read material. Period 5, we saw a big emergence of CMS tools, and that happened when I was in graduate school, where WebCT and Blackboard became extremely popular. And what this enabled was it lowered the bar for people to get involved in online learning. A greater proportion of professors could get involved in online learning without having to be as tech savvy and so forth. And so distance education became extremely popular, especially when you take into account blended kinds of things, where maybe they were still teaching face-to-face, but they were also doing a blended online kind of component with the CMS. And then this became so popular that you could argue now is kind of just the de facto way that things are done, and almost no classes are taught without some kind of online CMS component. Period 6, then we saw the read-write web, which this kind of emerged in parallel with mobile learning, but the idea was that instead of just having the internet being something where you got information from and maybe interacted in a discussion forum, it was also a place where you could create materials. So you could do things like create blogs, or create videos on YouTube, or create posters in Glogster and different things like that, and the students could create material for the web instead of just learning from the web. And this allowed for more constructivist kinds of approaches to online learning. So instead of just me talking to you and sending you some material on the internet, students were allowed to create things on the internet and be part of this information creation process. Like I said, kind of in parallel, mobile learning came out, where more and more we have students learning, but in realistic settings. So they take their devices with them, and they're on the job, they're in the classroom even, or they're at home, and they're learning on the go with their mobile devices. And I think that is going to increase substantially, because we've had it for a while, but the mobile devices have not been very powerful until just recently, and still are not quite there yet. But I bet in another 2 years, the difference between iPads and low-level netbooks will be so minuscule that you'll just have iPads and Transformer Primes and Android devices and things of that nature, and mobile learning will really have some powerful takeoff. And that brings us maybe to where we're at right now, where period 8. What do you think maybe the future could be? What kinds of crazy things might we have in the future, or maybe not crazy, but just maybe interactions between the face-to-face model and the online model? Do you predict completely online? Do you predict more of this blending kind of effect in maybe different ways? How do you see the next generation of online learning happening? I'd like you to answer that in the comments below. Finally, I'd like to just talk a little bit about some of the current trends that I see, and this is just my opinion again. I see a lot of talk about transactional distance, which is the Michael Moore theory, and that's the idea that what matters not so much is the miles between us, but the emotional distance between us. And you could be in a classroom with 500 students and have a really great transactional distance between one student in that class and the instructor. Whereas you can maybe have a very close transactional distance online if you're having a one-to-one Skype conversation. So there's different levels of distance there, and that was Michael Moore's idea, is that we should talk about online learning in terms of transactional distance, not physical distance. We also see a lot dealing with online collaboration, communities of inquiry, and social presence, which came from a researcher named Garrison, and which is the idea that you need to form communities where students can present themselves online both cognitively as well as socially, and that creates a feeling of closeness like they would have maybe in some kinds of face-to-face settings. CSCL, as I mentioned, the idea that we need to understand what's happening cognitively and socio-cognitively different online, and how that might be different than cognitive and social cognitive effects face-to-face. We see a lot with blended learning, a lot with different ways that we can interact, different technologies emerging, such as VoiceThread, video technologies, saying, you know what, there's better ways of interacting than just the traditional text-based discussion forum. And that's kind of really exciting for me as a social kind of learning person to see the different kinds of interactions that are coming out. There's also a lot of emphasis on, hey, originally people just wanted to get online, and they thought once they got online something magical would happen, and they found out that nothing magical really did happen. And so then they started turning back and saying we need to design effectively what we do online so that it specifically works for online settings. And so instructional designers are becoming very critical for this idea of making online learning more effective. And then also we're seeing a lot with open education, because if we move to online, then we can also incorporate more open materials, which will drive down the costs and increase access for more students. So that's another kind of trend that we're seeing a lot of. This leads us into the Handbook of Distance Learning, because you'll see most of these trends reflected in the handbook. And the handbook, yes, is a little bit old. This is from 2007, I believe. Is that correct? About 2007, 2008. But the new edition is coming out any month now, really. Charles Graham, myself, we have a couple chapters in there, some other people. And so that will be coming out in 2012, 2013, around that time frame. There will be some new chapters. But for right now, this is, I think, the premier handbook in the field, and probably the best one for getting a feeling for what's going on in the field of distance education.